My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran, Sivasankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue with Mahan's chapter 23. This topic is we covered in the earlier chapters in Mahan's book, the I God book, in one of the earlier chapters of thought, right? And here we talked about, if you see in chapter 2, we covered thought, universal thought, and so on. In this chapter, this is a sub-chapter of thought. Here he speaks about desires and how one uses, how one nurtures the thought, the type of thought that one nurtures, the kind of a lifestyle that one, has an impact on one's life. So here, Swamiji speaks about in a more kind of a subtopic of the broader thought in chapter 2. So if you see in chapter 2, we covered some of the aspects of what does a thought means, how one nurtures the thoughts. So here I'm going to go a little bit more in more detail in terms of our day-to-day life, right? So what we have is that let's first look at what is thought. And if you see, we covered this before. Thought, all of us have thoughts, thoughts, sometimes we say thoughts are just running, or thoughts are just, streaming. What is a thought, And we covered this in the earlier chapter. Thought is a measure of our experience, right? So we experience the world. And what happens is that, that experience, we have a memory of it, and that memory is a memory of our experiences that we then cherish it, or we, sometimes the experiences are good, sometimes the experiences are not so great. Whatever the experiences are, we store it in our memory. And as time goes on, we have a memory bank of, lots of thoughts. And we see that sometimes when a particular event happens, we are reminded, so the thought comes out. So we see that we have a kind of a memory bank, somewhat like a library of all the experiences that we have had. And that memory, sometimes, even if you're not doing anything, can flash back and give you that kind of a experience. Even though you're not engaging in it, you still have that experience. So we see that thought is a measure of experience. And we see that it is, when we look at more detailed definition of what thought is, we see that, one of the things that we see is that we need to define what we are actually trying to understand. So a more kind of, we know, okay, thought is a measure of experience, but what does that mean actually? So I looked at the Cambridge Dictionary, and it says that it's the act of thinking about or considering something, an idea or opinion, or a set of ideas about a particular subject. So it's interesting that, we have a hardware called the brain, and the software that enables us to interact, get an experience, measure that experience, and then store that experience. All of this takes place in the human mind. The software called the mind. You see, it happens, hardware in the brain. If the brain is not functioning properly, sometimes we are unable to, experience. We are unable to generate thoughts, or we may not have a complete thought. Or even if we have the thought, we tend to forget about the thought. It remains in the short-term memory, and it doesn't store in the long term, and we can't remember it. So we see that all this happens in the human mind. And it also happens, and what enables that is actually our brain. So both the brain and the mind needs to operate really well for you to get the full experience. So one needs to look after the brain very carefully, all the transmitters and so on, not abuse it with, all kinds of, intoxicants and, worries and anger and hatred. And all this have an impact on the hardware and also on the software, right? And we covered this quite extensively, right? So in a more scientific way, what is that thought? Thoughts are generated by neurons in our brains, and it releases chemicals in the brains, and the neurotransmitters play a key role in terms of the transmission of chemicals. And those chemicals generate electrical pulse, and then in one place, and it reverberates as it spreads out. That information, is passed on from one synapse to the other. So these electrical pulse spread like waves to other neurons, and this is how a thought is formed. And if the electrical pulse does not, get transmitted to the neighboring neurons, you can't remember what it is, or you can't cognize what it is, or you can't, understand that experience. So you need to have a good network of transmitters, neurons that are interconnected. All those things are the hardware that enables that electrical pulse to pass through, and for the whole network to be ignited so that the information becomes clearer. So the firing of the neurons is what generates thoughts. If the neurons don't fire, we see that you're unable to generate a thought, or the generation of thought is incomplete. And sometimes you see that we forget things, we don't remember things. All these are tied to the hardware in our brain, the networks within our brain, the neurotransmitters in our brain, and the ability of the neurotransmitters to permeate or spread these waves of waves of experience, or waves of electrical pulse. How fast it does do it also determines how fast we can comprehend things, how fast we can analyze things, how fast we can make sense of things. So this is why we see that meditation enables us to keep our hardware, strong, and also the bandwidth or neurotransmitters, we don't overuse it with frivolous things. And you see that the bandwidth of the brain increases. When the bandwidth increases, we see that any small thought will reverberate very quickly, and you're able to understand things. This is why focus, introspecting, contemplating, reflecting, and meditation is so crucial for the health of the brain and health of the mind. So we see that these thoughts, how well the thoughts are generated, how well the thoughts are experienced, how wholesome those experiences are, how much we learn from it, we make sense of it, all depends on, this practice that Mahan and other great saints have left behind. So we see that, I've given you a kind of three important definitions of what thought is: a measure of experience. It's about thinking, ideation, we're thinking, considering something, all that are part of the thought. And more importantly, from a scientific perspective, we see that the firing of the neurons is what generates those thoughts, right? So we see this. So what is it that actually, helps us generate these thoughts? There's a few things, that every time we think about something, our neurotransmitters are stimulated. Every time we think about positive and inspiring thoughts, elevating thoughts, relieving thoughts, all those things that are parts of our brains within our, there's neurotransmitters that will start reverberating, and it starts deepening. And when it starts deepening, it starts expanding the gray matter, whether it's the frontal cortex and other places. So you see that good thoughts reinforces that positive connectivity in our brains. And in the same way, when we have negative thoughts, anger, hatred, jealousy, all those things, it also reinforces that negative, connectivity that, always looks at things in a very negative way, right? So there is a reinforcing effect, a reinforcing of the networks in our brains. And the more positive we reinforce that the thoughts, the more positive our networks are, the more relieved, the more peaceful our mind is, the more inspirational our mind is. You see parts of our brain starts connecting, and reinforcing. Now, thoughts are one thing, but also the thoughts needs to have a transformative effect on the words that we generate. The words are an expression of the thoughts, right? So the words are an expression of the thoughts. So if our thoughts are noble, if our thoughts are inspirational, if our thoughts are kind, if our thoughts are, graceful, we see that our speech, our words will also be the same. And the first person that listens to that words is not the people outside you, the person inside you. So when you utter positive, inspirational thought, there's a reverberation that takes place within you that reinforces, the thought. So we see that there's an interesting connection between the words that we utter and the thoughts that we generate. The more positive our thoughts are, the more positive our speeches, our words are. And the more positive and inspirational our speech is, the more it reinforces that positive connectivity in our brains. And this is what we see, the symbiotic relationship. Very difficult for someone who's got positive thoughts, but the words come out differently, right? But we see that there are people that, sometimes they don't have good thoughts. They may say seemingly positive things, but one fine day, the true person comes out, right? So we see that, the thoughts that we generate, has a major impact on the DNA of our brain, DNA of our mind, and more importantly, the kind of words that come out from us, right? In that same way, we see that, our thoughts, have an impact on our speech. Our thoughts also have an impact on our action and our behavior. If we generate graceful thoughts, kind thoughts, generous thoughts, inspirational thoughts, you see that, not only our words, but our actions too become that. So we see that, as we do, positive things, graceful things, and as we speak, we see that both of that starts reinforcing and rewiring our brain to become more and more inspirational, more and more generating noble thoughts, more and more generating creative thoughts. So we see that this whole notion of desires, yes, human beings, like all other animals, have been imprinted with desires. You have the basic level desires of, eating, drinking, water. When you're thirsty, there's this instinctive thing that comes that searches for water, and also for procreating. So this is something that nature has built in the basic desires. Most animals have these desires, to fight for water, fight for food, fight for mates. All these are part and parcel of animal kingdom, and through evolution, we too have inherited that. And all this causes conflicts, and so on. You see in the animal kingdom, this fight for food, fight for mates, But human beings evolved over the period of time. And I think I covered in the earlier YouTube clips of the evolution of human beings and evolution of the human mind. And we started thinking, we started introspecting, we started organizing ourselves so that there's greater kind of collective actions as opposed to individual instinctive actions. That collective actions brought harmony, rules of engagement. We saw the formation of religious values. We moved towards a value-based, approach. And we see that our mind too started changing. Our mind too started recalibrating, right? As we started thinking in more collective way, the welfare of people, welfare of society, as opposed to the individual, we see that the individual instincts, slowly dissipated. Though it's there, it dissipated for the collective community, and we became more and more community oriented. And there are, differences between communities that sometimes bring them to loggerhead. But we have evolved towards becoming more and more, nation state, and then global community. And, very few become like Mahan, like mindset, where you now see everything as one. that universal values that guide them. So we saw that as their mind became more and more universal, the neural connectivity also started changing, and the minds, the software too started changing, and we started seeing more universal, more noble thoughts, more collective thoughts, more harmonious thoughts. And you see that, many of their words, their writings also became more and more harmonious about them and the collective and nature itself. And the actions too represent that, and that was just reinforcing. So the desires is not just an instinctive desires. It wasn't a zero-sum game, or what we say that you take things from people and so on, or push away desires, and sometimes we hear that, spiritual masters say you have to give up desires to attain enlightenment. And we see that, saints like Mahan and others says, well, desire is a part of our human existence. We need to learn to manage our desires. We need to, divinize our desires, so that when we understand our desires, where it's coming from our instinctive evolutionary path, or a nurturance of that wisdom and universal mindset. And as we move towards the latter, we see that, we have that ability to, become more transcendental, we understand our desires, we are able to divinize it, we're able to outlive it too. So we see that evolution in us starts taking place. And ultimately, you see that, you become more and more universal in your thought process. So in this, Swamiji says that how it reinforces one another. The question then is that how to generate these good thoughts or universal thoughts or speech or actions. I always get this thing, Guru, I sometimes get depressed, Guru, I get, I feel, negative about someone, and so on. So, even though they're practicing meditation or in some religious order, they have this challenge. The only way to overwhelm these thoughts is to partake in positive things, right? What does that mean? How do we generate positive thoughts? Associate with people who are generating positive thoughts, right? We see that, the more you associate with negative people, you will become very negative, right? When you associate with positive, inspirational people, there is something very interesting happens. There's what we call a spiritual osmosis or a mental osmosis. And eventually you see that the inspirational personalities vibration you absorb, and your mind and your thought processes starts changing. So, but if you hang around people who are negative, who are always complaining, who make all kinds of troubles, small issue becomes huge. When you associate with them, you see that you also absorb that values. So be very careful who you associate with. Sometimes, you have heard the saying that if I want to know what your state of your mind, I have to see the people that you associate with. So when you associate with positive people, inspirational people, when you read positive things, inspirational things, when you listen to positive things, inspirational things, there's a change that takes place in us. All I need to do is look at who they are associating with, what they are reading, and the kind of things that they listen or watch. I can clearly tell you the kind of personality that they are nurturing or have in place. So this is really important that, if you want to generate that good, positive, inspirational thoughts, you need to associate yourself, on a regular basis with people who are in that frequency, the books that you read, the songs that you listen, the speeches that you listen, all these are very important. The other aspect is also, how do we nurture good words? And this is so important, right? Sometimes, we have certain expressions in us, but we don't know the words, right? And this is why reading widely is very important, right? And one of the things that whenever I get a particular feeling, an experience, a thought, a measure of experience, when I get an experience that I cannot express, this is what I do. I go to the dictionary and start looking at the words that best describes the feeling that I have, right? And over the last 40 years, I was able to document all the words that have made me inspirational, my mind expand, generating new thoughts, all the vocabulary that expresses this experience, I have documented and written it down. And always observe that thoughts, and observe, and you see that when you absorb that thoughts, like for example, equanimity, what does it mean? These are big words, but when you look at it, wow, it's explaining and expressing a state of the mind that has experienced something, right? When we say, enriching mind, what does it mean? So you suddenly feel that, wow, my mind is so rich with knowledge, great ideas, and we start now, we have the vocabulary, the words to describe our feeling, right? When we have the words to describe our feeling, you see that our vocabulary, our mind is able to save all those experiences, the positive and inspirational experiences, and then tag it to the words and store it in the memory. And this is what happens. The next time when you're speaking to someone, or when you're writing a paper, or you're writing a poetry, you see that those vocabulary that you have, the experience that you have, now you have a word to describe it, and the word to speak about it, to write about it, to sing about it. You can express that, right, in multitudes of ways, right? So we see that when we experience this through introspection, contemplation, reflection, what is it that I'm experiencing? I'm feeling that beautiful feeling. Swamiji says, Summa irukum sugam. How do I express that? Right? That beautiful, unconditional joy. How do I express that? Right? That feeling of not being perturbed by anything. Equanimity. Beautiful word. The word of, samatva, the word shraddha. All this, wow, these are the experiences that I'm having that I can tag into words that I can express this collectively. So when our mind is able to understand and express this and store that in the memory, we now have a lot more choices of words we can use when we interact with people. So sometimes we want to scold people, or we want to tell them something in a more kind of vigorous way. We don't have to use very strong words. We can use more gentle and graceful words. And we see that when that happens, our speech becomes more refined. Our speech becomes more graceful. Our speech becomes more kind, because what you express, you have a word to describe it. And that words is stored in you, and you're able to express that, right? In that same way, when we're able to express it, then we're able to say, this is what it means, and this is what I need to do to experience this, for other people to experience it. So we see that when we think very deeply of what these inspirational qualities are, and when we search for the meaning of this word, to be able to verbalize it, and we use it daily in our speech, interactions with ourselves, with our family, with our children, with our friends, with our office colleagues, with our neighbors, it reinforces, right? And eventually we start seeing that our actions too starts transforming. And this is what we see, that most people say, I've got a nice feeling, a wonderful feeling, fantastic. But so what? It's like shock sindiri, right? So what? You're feeling this, but what does it actually mean? What does samatva means? What's feeling supreme means? What shraddha means, right? When you understand it, You see, you are able to express it. You're able to experience it. You're able to put it into action, right? So, if you come to my house, you'll see a huge Oxford dictionary, right? And one of the things I often do is I'll scan through. Is this describing what I have? If you come to my office, you'll see a huge Webster dictionary next to my table. Because suddenly I have an experience. I want to be able to express that in words, right? And, the dictionary allows me to say, okay, this is what it means, or this is what it's not it. And you start seeing that your vocabulary bank becomes extensive, right? In the same way, sometimes in Tamil, I hear words I don't know, may not know, but slowly I break it down, and eventually you see that Tamil word or the Sanskrit word becomes very profound. Why this is really important is that when we understand what we are experiencing and we have a word to express that, when you go back and start reading all the great saints and sages, or when you start listening to them, these words pop up because they also have experienced this and they're verbalizing it. And because you have learned to verbalize it, you can connect with them. You understand what they're experiencing, what you have experienced, and the convergence starts taking place. So when you don't put in that effort, you see that it just fleets away. That experience, okay, you got it, and then it disappears. But when you lock it on, what does it actually mean? What is this word that best describes this? And you think about it, that in itself is a meditation, right? So these are a few kind of tips I'm giving you how to strengthen, how to understand the thoughts, how to divinize it, and the experience that you get from it, how to verbalize it in all your vocabulary, in all your interactions, and then how to put it to action. So that when we do that, we see that there's a reinforcement that takes place, right? As what I described earlier. What I described to you in the last 3 to 5 minutes is so important, right? If you are able to do this, you see that the process of reinforcement takes place, and you see that your neural pathway now is on a search mode, an awareness mode, a deepening mode, and you start seeing your neural network starts deepening spiritually, right? The words now make sense. The words now gives you a kind of a hook to be able to experience what you're experiencing, right? So we see that there's a reinforcement in our neural pathway, because what I said earlier is that when you understand something is when the firing takes place and the whole reverberation takes place. When you pick up new words that expresses your feeling, it reverberates throughout your network. When you think about it, it reinforces, and eventually that network becomes inspirational. It generates only inspirational thoughts, lofty thoughts, supreme thoughts. All those great thoughts that I spoke about is what it's going to reinforce. So even though you plant a negative thought, it'll be subsumed by it. You can throw in a huge, the Twin Towers, like a challenge into this network. It'll subsume it and bring it back, to that supreme and, enlightened thoughts. So this reinforcement neural pathway, starts taking place when you follow that process that I spoke about. So this is what Swamiji says. He says that good thoughts cannot be destroyed by any means. So when your network or your neural network or your brain is so attuned to this kind of things, nothing stops it. No barrier can stop it, right? And you see that, this thought waves is what, comes from people who are enlightened. And you see that they are the ones that actually rule the world. You see, so Swamiji says, that people who are intellect and people who are knowledgeable are the ones that are essentially going to be playing an important role in this administration. You see, during the COVID crisis, everybody was, helter-skelter. But it took a few thinkers to think about what is this virus is all about. It stopped everybody on tracks. until the thinkers thought through what this virus was, understand the virus really well, treat it, bring in a vaccine to inoculate everybody from this virus. In that same way, the human mind is like the scientist, it's like the knower. Yes, there is a deviant thought that's come into my mind. How do I understand its impact on me? How do I isolate it? How do I inoculate it? How do I make sure that the thought doesn't, contaminate all the other pathways? And ultimately, how do I subsume that thought so that it becomes a fuel for generating enlightening thoughts? And that's how we see that, as how we all have had our vaccines for COVID. We all are going to be exposed to COVID, but the difference is that the vaccination enables us to, the virus may get into our system, but it will not have an adverse impact because the antidotes will essentially neutralize it. In that same way, when our neural networks are really strong with the spiritual, understanding and awareness, we see that no matter what you throw in, it'll be subsumed and it will not be wasted. It'll be used as a foundation of further enlightenment. And that's what Swamiji says, that good thoughts keep the heart and the mind cool, calm and cool, like the Hamsa, the swan that is swimming so beautifully gliding, but is working really hard within. He says, good thoughts strengthen the heart and the mind. It's not only cool, but it also strengthens the heart and the mind. You've got the resolve. And finally, he says that good thoughts make one energetic and ennoble the world. We become powerful. We become very energetic, and we are able to, teach others on what are the noble qualities by example. And this is what Swamiji speaks about, that the thought that we generate is very, very important. I want to finish off today with a beautiful, poetry by Jalaluddin Rumi, who was like Mahan, that lived in the 12th century. He says that you are your thought. What you generate is what your life will be, right? He says the rest of it is bones and fiber. It's the mind that moves it. It's the mind that nourishes the body. It's the mind that does everything, right? If the mind says, look, I'm stop eating, the whole body will shut down, right? In the same way, he says that if you think of roses, you are a rose garden. So if you think about something beautiful, you become that beauty. If you have heavenly thoughts, you become the heaven. If you, think about angelic divine thoughts, you become that angel, right? But if you think of thorns, right? If you see the tree and if you see the beauty of the roses, you are that rose. But if you think of thorns, that pricks you and makes you, he says, you're fueled by that furnace. Furnace is always that uneasiness, that burningness, right? So the same plant, we can see it in a different way. One is the beauty. The other one is that prickly feeling that we get, the uncertainty, that troubling things. The choice is us. We make the choice. Nobody makes the choice for us. No divinity from outside, no externality that determines our state of our thought and state of our life. We have full control over it. What we think, we become. If we think, we have divinity in us, if we think we are the divinity, we become the divinity. So this is what Mahans and other great saints teach us, that how we manage our mind. The whole process of enlightening or self-realization is actually about reforming, refining, transforming our mind to become, truly universal, understand the true state of our own existence. If we did that, I think life will be an awesome journey. Sandosham.